Hello, so this is a video extolling the virtues of playing the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven and the Pathetique Sonata. Why? Well, in my opinion, they're ideal sonatas for a beginner to begin on, and I think that these sonatas will hold you in good stead all your life as interesting, fun and exciting pieces to play. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because of the differences between the sonatas. So let's talk about their movements. Okay, they're both in the minor key, of course, C minor and C sharp minor. But if we look at the first movements, they're very, very different first movements. Of course, with the massive C minor chord of the Pathetique Sonata, beginning that sonata's first movement, and hurtling through those tremoli, which are in the left hand, and there's such a stupendous first movement. Really, it's almost unsurpassed in the whole of the piano literature, the whole of the canon. That first movement, so incredibly amazing. Now let's compare that with the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. A completely different atmosphere. It's a sostenuto. I think it's a very slow piece. It's perhaps this piece that the person thought about. I think it's Rellstab, the poet, thought about the lake. There's Lake Lucerne, about which he said that this sonata reminded him. It was obviously that first movement. It's completely serene and calm. It's like a Chopin nocturne, in a way. And so it's a completely different first movement in every possible way. Okay. Second movement. We have the Pathetique second movement, a complete a breathtaking monument to the arts. Is the second movement of the Pathetique Sonata. Beautiful, sublime, and very different in its individual parts. It's got different sort of episodes in it. An incredible movement. Let's look at the Moonlight Sonata. Again, completely different. It's simple. It's actually on one page. It's what's the word? It's quite funny. It's humorous. It's quite simple, and it's a completely different. It's got a completely different mood. I'm talking about diametrically opposed moods. That first movement of the Pathetique is diametrically opposed to the Moonlight. That's why you have these. That's why I would recommend learning these two sonatas. Are completely diametrically opposed. The second movement's diametrically opposed in their nature, but both brilliant. Yeah. And then the third movement's again completely different in nature. I mean, they're both fast movements, that has to be said, but then again, what would you expect of a final movement to a sonata? It has to be fast, but completely different. The Pathetique sonata it's interesting. It's very diverse. It's got at least 3 very diverse sections, and it's connected by a quite difficult theme. It's actually quite difficult, that theme, but it's very. It sounds quite classical. It could be a Mozart piece, except it's in the minor, so it doesn't sound that much like a Mozart piece or a classical piece. But it's sort of a little bit like a classical piece, which Beethoven is now moving out. He's moving music out of into the Romantic era. So it's It is slightly got that classical feel to it, but absolutely wonderful. It's a wonderful third movement, and of course it has links to the first movement and the second movement. So it's very, very, very interesting. And I think interesting is what I would call that movement. It's an interesting, and it's so lively. It's a very it's a propulsive, if that's a word, piece, which is very, very interesting, and an amazing ending to it as well. Okay, then we're going to compare that to the Moonlight Sonata's final movement, which is a celebrated movement through all piano literature. Some people can play it very, very fast. I'm talking about people like Evgeny Kissin, very, very fast. Tiffany Poon, Wilhelm Kempf, Brendel, and a lot of people can do it incredibly well and incredibly fast. What's that pianist's name? Valentina Lisitsia. Lisitsia. Very, very fast. And it's just so fast that there's a marked difference between that and the Pathetique third movement. The third movement of the Pathetique is a rondo form, which the third movement of the Moonlight is not. They're very, very different in a way. Not as different as the first movements of each sonata, but nevertheless, I mean, and it ends in a concerto-like way, to quote Andras Schiff, who does a talk about all the sonatas on YouTube. He says that it sounds like the ending of a concerto, the end of that movement. It's a bit like the cadenza in a concerto, in a Mozart concerto or something. But it's not at all Mozartian. It's completely, for me, it's the first romantic sonata. That whole sonata, that first movement and that last movement, for me, that propels music into the Romantic era. I know most people would say it's a bit classical. It's not yet late Beethoven. It's not even middle Beethoven. But for me, it is innovative enough for that single sonata to propel music into the Romantic era in the same way that the Pathetique sonata was important enough to propel music out of the classical era. Not quite into the Romantic era yet, despite that very romantic second movement. I think took the Moonlight Sonata to do that. Anyway, it's very different, nevertheless, from the third movement of the Pathetique Sonata. Some examples of third movements which are not so different would be the Appassionata Sonata. That's actually quite similar to the Moonlight Sonata third movement, and they have the same ending. By the way, quite so there's not such a big difference there, whereas there is a fair difference between the Pathetique third movement and the Moonlight. So in any case, these two sonatas are very, very different to each other, which means you're going to be not bored as you learn them and as you play them. Also, very importantly, they can be learnt from a beginner. You can start with the Moonlight Sonata first movement, and then I would suggest going on to the Pathetique. The Pathetique second movement is, possible. I think even the first movement is possible if you do it all slowly. They're the only sonatas really of Beethoven which you can learn as a beginner. I'm not including those two sonatas, Opus 49, which Beethoven didn't even really think so highly of. Liked, if that's the pronunciation, liked sonaten. But otherwise, these two are the simplest sonatas, and they're some of the best. And as I've tried to explain, some of the most innovative, and so therefore the most important in piano music history. So I would strongly recommend learning these two pieces for their ease and especially for their difference. They're so different in each movement, and so that's what I would like to my children to learn. If you're going to learn any music, why not learn those two? In addition, I think a great accompaniment to that would be to learn Schubert's Four Impromptus, Opus 90. Again, incredibly good, incredibly beautiful, and quite easy. You can learn those four, I think, from a beginner, starting with the third one, and you can do the fourth one, and then the second one, and the first one. The first is the most difficult, but again doable after having done the Beethoven sonatas, and it makes a really great contrast with Beethoven. For me, those impromptus also sort of herald the beginning of a new era in music, of piano music really, the beginning of the miniature. And I think that began with Schubert and those impromptus. So they're also very important. They're perfect in themselves as single pieces. You know, he didn't need to do sonatas. I think he realised he wasn't gonna match up to Beethoven with sonatas. He went on to these impromptus. I mean, I know he was doing sonatas, and the last piece I think was the B flat. It was the B flat major sonata. B flat major, yeah, B flat major sonata, the last one. But nevertheless, he was, I think, the first person to do these miniatures, to do it in such a way as to present to the world very important, perfectly artistically beautiful small pieces. So there we go, that's my recommendation for your piano playing. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.